Hi everybody, this is Nick from Nickology, making a new video about retro video game collecting. Now, I recently saw a video by Happy Console Gamer, which I absolutely love his channel, about why people collect retro video games. And that's a very good question, because that actually has changed quite a bit over the years. For me, when I went into retro video game collecting, kind of like what he did, as he outlined in his video, was he started out as a kid just playing video games. And, you fall in love with a bunch of games and you fall in love with a bunch of media as a kid. And, you play it because you love the games, you love the experience, you love the stories, you love the action. And for me, I also love the music, so that was very, very visceral to me. It was a very neat experience, kind of like, movies, where it takes you away from real life stuff that's happening. And, at a very young age with the Master System and Atari and Sega Genesis later on, fell in love with video games. And later on, probably around 2000, 2001-ish, is when I really actually started to collect video games actively. I had some of my games from like Sega Genesis and 32X and PC games and stuff like that, and I had gotten Dreamcast as well. So I was a big Sega fan and Atari fan, and that's when the game market was really good then. It was a lot easier. Everybody was dumping PlayStation 1 games and N64 games and Sega Saturn and Super Nintendo. All of those games that were out in the past few years before, people were getting rid of them because the newest generation was coming around, PS2 and GameCube and Xbox. And it was a really good time for a high school kid to get into video games on a low budget. I remember picking up my Sega Saturn from FuncoLand. I think I got it with the cables and one controller. I think it was like $40, something like that, in a brown box, a FuncoLand box. And picked up just a bunch of games at like garage sales. And I remember getting some new games like Panzer Dragoon Zwei. I think I got like 2 copies for like $5 each. So a lot of the collection that I have, I actually started back then. I haven't really been buying a lot of retro games the past at least 5 years. Back then, that's when my passion was really starting for games, and I was collecting the games that I really wanted to play. I wasn't like, I gotta get a whole complete set of Sega Genesis games, while it's cheap. No, I didn't really care about that. There's a lot of games I don't like. There's a lot of filler games for me that, if I went out and bought, 20 sports games, I'm not really a big sports game fanatic. I know some people, they got to get their Maddens every single year, and that's fine. That's what you're into, but that wasn't what I was into. And, so I sought out the games that I really wanted to play. Like, I think Saturn, again, going back to Saturn, that was the system that I really wanted back in like 1997, and I never got it. I had the 32X, I had PC. I was really big into PC gaming at that time. Half-Life came out in 98, or that's when I bought it. It was in 98. Grand Theft Auto, the original one. PC gaming for me was kind of the filler in the mid 90s. Beyond the Sega Genesis and 32X that I had. And that was kind of the one crown jewel was the Saturn. And I'm kind of glad I got into it a little early because I was able to get the titles that I really wanted out of the way, mostly at that time. I would say between like 2000 and 2012 is like the big time that I collect. I collected a lot of my stuff and got it at a fairly reasonable price. I know the Nintendo stuff either kept its price or started going up pretty early in the late 2000s. So That was a little bit harder to collect for, and honestly, I don't have as big of a passion for it. So I got the main titles that I wanted, like some of the Super Nintendo stuff, Final Fantasy III and Chrono Trigger and stuff like that. I got that pretty cheap back then. But yeah, it's, for me, the game collecting has really evolved over time, and it's gone from, for me, it's gone from collecting the games that I wanted back then, and I still kind of look out. There's a couple titles that I'm looking out for, and they're astronomical prices, like Snatcher for Sega CD. I never got a hold of one. I never pulled the trigger on one back then when it was like $100, and I should have, of course. But recently, I've gotten a Panasonic 3DO, a Gold Star 3DO model, and I got that at a really good price from a collector, and those are the kind of systems that I really filled in, because I played PC games in the 90s, and a lot of 3DO titles were kind of like full motion video PC cross titles, ones that came out on PC, CD-ROM at the time, and then also came out 3DO. So for me, that's more of a nostalgia trip, like Seventh Guest. But anyways, yeah, so there's a lot of great titles that on that system I was like, well, let me get into it and slowly buy those games. But that's pretty much the only game system I've really bought recently that I fell in love with after. Now, it's interesting because, again, game collecting has evolved for a lot of people. There's people my age range that are playing it for nostalgia reasons. They're getting into it, or have been into it, or getting back into it with the new mini consoles for nostalgia. Hey, I played as a kid, and that's fun. That's really cool to get into and fun. It's pretty hard, I would say, anymore to really, if you wanted to brand new start a collection, there's a lot of stuff from back then that's hard to get into just because it's price prohibitive. I mean, I'm talking Super Nintendo, Sega CD, again, Sega Saturn. A lot of the early mid-90s stuff is really getting up there in price. Now, there's some stuff that you can still get into, like Atari 2600, 7800. Those are pretty reasonable, I would say, at least from what I remember seeing. There's some newer systems that are still pretty easy to get into, like original Xbox. Good time to get into that right now, honestly, because the prices are still fairly great on the games. Even the backwards compatible games are just, still fairly cheap to get into. GameCube has always been kind of hit or miss, depending on the game that you want. Sometimes you could pay retail, sometimes you could pay a bit more for the game, but Wii, a lot of those systems that came out 15 to 20 years ago now are still pretty easy to get into. But yeah, I mean, the reasons why people collect, some people have to have a full set. For me, game collecting has evolved where, I had the games that I want. I have the games that I really enjoyed and played, and I go back and play them for nostalgia reasons. But for me, what the most interesting part about game collecting now, or retaining my game collection, is because of the attention to video game collecting the past 5 or so years, maybe longer. And with YouTube and a lot of other game collecting sites, retro game fan sites and Facebook and whatnot, the interest is there, and a lot of people are either rediscovering it or growing their collection. Technology is getting a lot better, so that people, I feel like a byproduct of these YouTube channels and whatnot, and these groups keeping the popularity alive with retro game collecting, you're starting to see a lot of new ways to play those games, or a lot of better ways that people are enhancing the way they play games, like the let's say upscaling, OSSC, and FrameMeister, and all those third-party video cables that people are making to make it easier and cheaper to get a better video signal out of your game system. That alone, I think, really, for me, kind of reinvigorated my interest. In the States, we never had an RGB SCART cable for our TV, so it's to be able to, instead of growing my video game collection, I'm basically making better ways to be able to play my games on a newer display or be able to stream games. If you can convert the HDMI, it's a lot easier to get a better picture quality to not only to your TV but also to stream on Twitch or Mixer. And so a lot of those types of solutions, system modding, being able to get a consoleized Game Gear and be able to, play your Game Gear games on a television with very minimal effort. I remember modding used to be like, oh, install a mod chip in your PlayStation or region switch, and that was pretty much what you had until Xbox came out, and a lot of those people started modding, putting in different hard drives, and that was really started to make it more exciting to me. I have my Dreamcast hooked up to a DreamPi setup with a Raspberry Pi, so you can play Phantasy Star Online and other online enabled games again online, through Ethernet or Wi-Fi, and that's really cool. That is really, not only can I play Phantasy Star Online again for the first time in 20 years online with other people, but it's fairly easy to set up. You still have to have a little bit of knowledge of this, and it can take a little bit of patience looking up tutorials and whatnot, but it's easier than ever to be able to play these retro games that I already have using better technology, upscaling and new controllers coming out for retro game systems like the Dreamcast. It's a lot of crowdfunded stuff. So for me, I think it's, even though the prices have gone up on these games and it's a bit more price prohibitive to get into retro game collecting, modification has really been an invigorating point for me, keeping my game collection going and keeping the spark alive for me collecting my games. So that's really kind of how I've evolved into my game collection, and that's and it's going to be really interesting to see where this hobby goes next 5 and 10 years. But I'm not opposed to people using emulation or whether it's hardware or software emulation, or especially on games like I mentioned earlier, a Snatcher, burning a disc and putting in your Sega CD hardware and playing it. Would you rather do that or spend $600 on one game that was pressed 25 years ago and you don't know the condition of the disc? I understand it, and it can be kind of ridiculous. But I've also kind of expanded also from retro games into some more audio video collecting as well on the side, like some Laserdisc. I've been really getting back into VHS here and there. I'm on the lookout for a Betamax player, so that's been relatively priced well. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. Is I don't really buy too many games anymore for my retro game systems. I buy some newer games for like Xbox One and Switch and whatnot, but it really is still a big passion of mine, and I'm not really going for a full collection on anything, maybe 32X, but I don't have Spider-Man, and that's probably never going to happen unless I find one in the wild for really cheap. But that being said, no, I thought it was a really great question as to, why do you collect retro games still in 2020, and how has the hobby evolved? And for me, it's a very personal question. Everybody does it for a different reason. Everybody gets into it for a different reason, whether it's to discover new games that they've never seen before, or they've watched videos on YouTube and like, oh, that looks really interesting and really cool, and they want to play it for the first time. I feel like it's going to only get better from here. I feel like there's going to be a lot more interest in retro game collecting going forward because of the modders, because of the people making new hardware for the old retro video game systems, and it's going to be really great. I feel like even though the prices are going up and have always kind of gone up the past 10 years or so or more, it's still going to be a great hobby to be a part of. And yeah, that's pretty much why I retro collect still, and I feel like it's a great community backing the effort, backing the spark. There's a lot of great groups on Facebook that answer questions for people getting into the hobby, or spreading the love and the joy and interest, making new fan art for it, like I've covered previously on the channel with Dave making his custom Saturn artwork. That really also helped me keep the spark and the joy alive for my Saturn collection, which is one of my favorites. But yeah, no, that's why I do it. And I think it was a great question, and I wanted to kind of give my honest answer as to why I still have a retro game collection in 2020. So, well, thank you so much for sticking around. This is another video from Nickology, and can't wait to release some more. So, y'all take care now. Have a great day.